Welcome back to our CB Matrix Ministering to Youth module. So we've been talking about what is the goal of youth ministry, which I hope you know. I hope you never forget what the goal of youth ministry is, to help students become disciples of Jesus, who make disciples of Jesus. And then we've talked about the role of parents and all of that, because discipleship is certainly a team thing. It's a team effort. We don't do it on our own, but youth leaders combined with parents work together and combined with the whole church really to make disciples of the next generation. And so as you're thinking about that, I hope you've had a lot of fruitful discussions about how to promote that at your church, especially how to promote parents becoming leaders, disciple makers of their students, their kids. I hope you've thought of a lot of ways to do that and apply that at your church. And one thing I always say to parents, and I say to myself too, is it's hard. No matter how old your kids are, it's hard to lead them and to disciple them. And it's okay if you make mistakes. It's okay if you don't always get it right. The key is to keep moving forward and keep trying and growing with your family. But what I want to do now is I want to begin to give you a model of youth ministry. That's what we're going to talk about in this session, is a model for reaching out to youth. Because there's a lot of different models out there for how to do youth group, and a lot of models that do a lot of good things. But what I want to give you is what I'm calling the center of youth ministry, which is small groups and mentor relationships. Just to tip my hand a little bit, as you can probably see in your notes, I'm going to argue that the best way to grow students into disciples who make disciples is through small groups and through mentoring relationships. And so I'll talk about what that means. Now, before we do that, I want to give you another thought, something to think about. What's the best small group that you have ever attended? What's the best small group that you've ever been a part of? Maybe it was when you were young. Maybe it's now, currently, as an adult. It could be a men's group or a women's group or a couples group that you're a part of. But what's the best small group that you've ever been part of? Now, I hope it was a church-based. I hope it was a Christian small group. It was the best one. And I want you to think about and discuss what made it so special. What were the elements of that small group that made it so great? Now, I'll tell you about probably my best small group that I've been a part of. It was when my wife and I in Oregon. We were part of a small group, and the small group ended up being so special, I think, because it was filled with meaningful relationships. That we came into this small group and we didn't really know people very well. We were new to the area. We didn't have a lot of connections, a lot of friends, but we got to know the members of our small group. We were in a similar time of life as all of them. We were all married, but we didn't have kids yet, and we had really fruitful discussions, and our small group got to know each other like many small groups do, through hanging out and spending time together outside of group. But I really believe that what made our group so special and so meaningful were that we had really intentional relationships, really meaningful relationships, that we didn't just talk about sports or things that were interesting in the culture and the news at the time, but we talked about real stuff. The guys got together and we prayed for each other, and we talked about issues in our lives and struggles in our lives, and the wives did the same. And we really ministered to one another, and we learned the Bible together, and we served with one another, and we ended up, hanging out and going camping together. And it was just a really special time to be in it was a really special small group for us, where we really connected and where we really grew as Christians. I think, I've been in a lot of small groups, and I've always learned stuff in my small groups, but not every small group has helped me really grow as a Christian, but that one did. And so it was really special to me, and I look back on it fondly. Now, as you think about the great small groups that you've been a part of, or the great small group that you've been a part of, or maybe you haven't been yet, I hope you'll find that what made it great wasn't just the hangout time. It wasn't just the brownies that were brought every week, or the cookies, or anything like that. I hope what made it great were the relationships, as you authentically connected to God and connected to other people in a meaningful way, because really that's one of the things that can happen in a small group, and why I think small groups are so important, that they're about helping people grow in their relationship with God. And in this session, what I want to do, I want to kind of explore with you why I think small groups and small group ministry and mentor relationships are the center, or need to be the center of your youth ministry. And I want to begin by talking about some of the one other youth ministry model that's very prevalent, and why I would kind of recommend not going after that model. And so I want to talk about, as I have there on the notes, a little tongue-in-cheek there, the problem with the youth service and the cool youth pastor. Okay, so I want to talk about that, and nothing against cool youth pastors. Just if there's any cool youth pastor listening, I'm sure I appreciate your coolness. It was a little tongue-in-cheek. I'm just trying to wake everybody up for the next point here. But what I'm talking about here is the model of youth ministry that is centered around a large service. Like, so some youth groups, and maybe it can start even with small groups like 20 or 40 students or until it gets much larger. But a lot of youth groups build their ministry around one large service. And this service might happen, often will happen on a weeknight, or it might happen on Sunday night, or even if you have a large campus, it could happen in another building on a Sunday morning. But this is a service that is just dedicated to youth. And the service typically involves great worship and lights and video and dynamic teaching, and is a lot of fun. Youth services can be a lot of fun and can be really exciting in a lot of ways. But I think that for many churches, the youth service model is not the right model, especially if you're a smaller church or medium-sized church. But I even think if you're a large church, I don't think that the youth service model is the way to go, even though that's kind of what we fall into a lot. Usually if you have a youth group that has some success, it starts to grow. Maybe you hire a youth pastor who is successful in some way and attracts a lot of people to himself. You might end up with a bigger group, and so you might put on a youth service of some kind. But at the end, I think that you'd be better off doing a different model of youth ministry involving small groups and mentoring relationships. And so what I want to do is I want to point out a few problems with the youth service model. So problem number one is that youth services are hard to pull off. Youth services are hard to pull off. This is something, again, when I took over the youth ministry of our church, we had about 200 students, and we would gather together for a large youth meeting. Actually every week. Every week we were gathering together at one of our locations for a youth meeting. And there was some parts of it that were fun, but it was really hard to pull off because every week you had to have a sermon and somebody had to preach it. And somebody had to be ready to preach it and ready to go, and someone had to be, compelling and interesting and be able to hold the attention of 200 students in a big room with lots of stuff going on. It required a worship band that had some level of excellence to carry off a big service. It required lights. It required slides and videos, and slides and videos don't make themselves. It turns out, I found out, that that doesn't just magically appear. And so somebody had to make slides, somebody had to make videos, someone had to run sound, somebody had to run lights, somebody had to clean out the trash afterward, and somebody had to clean the bathrooms. Otherwise, we'd get, a bunch of complaints for the women's Bible study that met in the building the next day. And so there was just a lot. There was a lot that went in to that big youth service, and it was a real drain on our resources. It was a real drain on our leadership resources in a lot of ways. And most churches, just the reality is that a lot of churches are just not going to be able to pull off a large youth service. Right now we have 6 campuses. We have 5 youth groups that meet weekly and then divide up into small groups. And even in our campuses, most of our campuses couldn't pull off a big youth service that was really impressive from the stage. It just takes too many people doing too many skilled jobs. And it just takes up a lot of time to track down everything that you need to pull off a big youth service. And so youth services are hard to pull off. They're expensive. They require a lot of personnel that's skilled in specific areas. And so that's kind of one problem. Problem number 2 is in a youth service allows students to get lost in the crowd. Now, what I noticed was we'd have these services, we'd have maybe 200 students there, maybe a little more sometimes, and the worship band would start. And we had an awesome worship team. We've been really blessed at our church. We have amazing worship leaders, amazing youth worship leaders, and that's always been a real strength of ours. So we'd have this great worship time, but what I noticed is like the first 3 or 4 rows of the worship service were amazing. Those first 3 or 4 rows of students, they were engaged. They had their hands up. They were praying. They were singing. They were, jumping up and down. It was just like, it was awesome. It was really exciting and really inspiring. I wanted to get down there and jump with them if I wouldn't look so weird. Being so much older than them, I would have wanted to do that. But it was really cool. But what I noticed as I stood in the back is I looked, and right about the halfway point of the auditorium, then all the way going back to the edge, many of the students in the back half of the auditorium were unengaged. They were on their phones, they were talking, they were hanging on their boyfriend or girlfriend, they were doing stuff that they weren't paying attention to the service. There was a constant train of students leaving the auditorium, going to the lobby and bathroom, whatever, back and forth. And as cool as it was for those students in the first 3 rows, there were many students that were just sort of checked out and were very, very much not engaged. And you know what that's like. If in our Sunday services we see the same kind of thing. Like if people just come to church on Sundays and your church is bigger than, I don't know, 20 people probably, it's easy to get lost in the crowd, right? It's easy for people just to show up on Sundays and not really sing, not really engage, and then just leave without talking to anybody. And that was really happening at our big youth services, is that kids weren't really engaged. They weren't really connecting to anyone. And so they were lost in the crowd. A third problem that I noticed was that our leaders were sidelined. Our leaders were sidelined. Now, I said it takes a lot of resources to pull off a big youth service, and it does, but there's only so much that youth leaders can do during the youth service, because either you preach, or you lead the worship team, or you do announcements, but that's about it. There's really not a lot for you to do. And one of the things that really frustrated me a lot was that we had 24 youth leaders, and most of them were just kind of hanging around in the lobby, not really sure what to do, kind of looking for students to talk to. Most of them were talking to each other. And then once the youth service started, they were just kind of there. And there was no real purpose. I didn't feel like they had a real purpose there. And we started to lose some of our youth leaders, and I think it's just because they liked the excitement of the youth service, but they got into this to help students and disciple students, and they weren't given that opportunity because there's not a lot to do during a service, right? Even, again, our Sunday services, there's only so much to do from the stage. And so our youth leaders were sidelined, our youth leaders weren't engaged, and they wanted to help students, but we, the church, we failed them because we didn't really allow them to lead. Problem number 4 here is the cool youth pastor. All right, so let me explain what I mean by that. And that's that, sometimes a youth group will grow because of a very charismatic youth pastor. I mean theologically charismatic, but like just cool and good from the stage and a good teacher and stuff, and that's great. I have a lot of friends. I've never been a cool youth pastor myself, but I know them. I've seen them before, and I've longed to be one of them at times. No, so what will happen in a youth group is that the cool youth pastor, he'll be really dynamic, and he'll draw a lot of students to himself. And people come to Christ, which is amazing. But a lot of times what happens is, any of us, we can only make so many connections. One of my favorite books on this subject is by Joey Bonifacio, who is a pastor in Manila, and he has a book called The Lego Principle, which I'd highly recommend for you to check out. It's on discipleship. It's not about youth discipleship per se, but it's really just about discipleship in general. It's an excellent book, The Lego Principle. And in the Lego Principle, he talks about that is just as humans. He says people are like Legos. We're built for connection. We're built for connection with God and for connection with each other. But just like a Lego, if you can, I don't have a Lego here, but if you imagine I'm holding a Lego, it only has so many places to connect, right? It has only so many little holes on the bottom to be connected and little nubs on top to have another Lego attached to. And the point of that is to say that every person only has room for so many connections. And so the problem, if you have a youth group that's based just upon a youth pastor, it's all based around the personality of the youth pastor, there's only so many students who can connect to that pastor, right? There's only so many students who can have that relationship with that youth pastor. And if that youth pastor is the one that makes the youth ministry go, then, if you're a student and you're not friends with a youth pastor, you kind of feel like you're a leftover. You're just not really part of the central group of the youth ministry. And so what happens is in a youth service kind of model or in a youth pastor-centric model, everything falls upon the youth pastor, and the youth group is really limited by his connections and what he can do and what he can pull off. And so, again, I'm not trying to say anything negative about youth pastors. I don't think most of them go into it trying to they're not trying to build a ministry around themselves. It's just, it happens. It happens in youth ministry. It happens in churches. I mean, I'm sure we all know churches that even aren't very big, but the church is built around the personality of the pastor. And so that's very dangerous, because we're like Legos, and so we only have so many connections, and so we need to be thoughtful about the connections that we make. We have to give students opportunities to connect to others beyond just the youth pastor or the youth director. But then problem number 5 there is, it doesn't help us accomplish the goal of youth ministry. I guess at the end of the day, the biggest problem, I believe, with the youth service model is that it doesn't really clearly, in my mind, help us accomplish the goal of youth ministry, right? It's not clear exactly how a worship service and preaching every week, and that's all there is, how that really helps students become disciples of Jesus and helps them make disciples of Jesus. Because at best what you can do is you can preach at them and you can talk at them, which has its role, but again, you can't follow up with them, you can't get inside their heads, you don't know what they're thinking. And so there are some significant drawbacks to the youth service model. Now, let me say, I'm not totally saying that we should just trash getting together in large groups. I think there's great things that you can do when you get youth together. It can be very catalytic to get a lot of students together. We still, from time to time when we've gotten all our students together, it's very catalytic. It's very exciting. Our retreats are still combined. In our region of our state in Utah, every year there's an event that gathers together like 1,000 students, and it's pretty exciting to be in a room with 1,000 students. And so obviously things like worship can happen on a catalytic level, and so it's great to have some big youth events like that, or some big youth services every once in a while, in order to be catalytic, in order to celebrate, and in order to just kind of get everyone excited about what God is doing in your church or in your region. So I'm not against those, but again, what's the goal of youth ministry? And I think that the goal of youth ministry is going to be much better served in small groups. And that leads us to our next point there, that I believe real discipleship happens in small groups. Real discipleship happens in the small group. The center of your youth ministry, even if you're gonna, you maybe you just feel like you can't get rid of your youth service. That's how we felt for a while. So I understand that. It took us a long time to get rid of our youth service. So maybe you feel like you can't give that up, or maybe you feel like you need to have everybody come together for a while. That's fine. But I really firmly believe that the center of your youth ministry needs to be the small group, because that's where discipleship happens. Now, when I'm talking about small groups, I generally think of small groups as consisting of 5 to 15 people. So you'd have 2 leaders in there. Ideally, you'd have 2 leaders, and that's because some safety and security reasons, and also some mentoring reasons. You'd have 2 leaders in there, adult leaders, and then you'd have anywhere from 5 to 15 students. I think probably the ideal size is maybe 10 or so. But you might have to go a little larger or smaller, just depending on your church. But I think that should be the center of your youth ministry. Now I'm going to talk about small groups, and I'm also going to mention mentoring. And I've mentioned both those, so let me just clarify that a little bit. I think that mentoring is what is more the one-on-one relationships. So the way that we lay out our youth ministry model is that we have small groups. But then beyond just the small group, what we try and do, and we're always growing at this, but what we try and do is have our leaders also view themselves as mentors for certain students, and to take on certain students to kind of lead one-on-one, or maybe they'll lead one leader and several students for follow-up, and they can really deepen and grow their relationship. So small groups and mentoring are all kind of working towards the same end, and even at times I might use those interchangeably, because mentoring can happen in the small group as well. But I want to kind of give an apology. I want to give an argument for 5 reasons. I think I have 5 here. You can see in your notes there why small groups are the way I think you should go for your youth ministry. First of all, you can learn the needs of your students in the small group. One thing that became very clear to me when we were just doing large group is that we just didn't know where students were at. Like personally, there's the students that the youth pastor had been attached to, or there is the students that certain leaders would kind of draw themselves toward. But the average student in our church, and especially even the average student who attended our youth ministry, people didn't really know where they were at spiritually. And students get lost in a large group. And so the small group, I think, is the place where leaders can really know their students. You can have a sense, is this kid struggling in their life? Now, they might hide stuff from you, right? And they might not share everything with you, and you can only do your part. But you're going to have a much better chance of knowing, is one of my students, is their parents going through a divorce? One of my students, is he or she doubting their faith? Was one of my students, are they doing something with their boyfriend or girlfriend they shouldn't be doing? You can find that out more if you have connections in a small group or mentoring relationship. Now, number two, a second benefit is that students can form meaningful relationships in the small group, right? Students want relationships, right? More than even maybe adults do. Adults need relationships, but a lot of guys especially, we might push away sometimes from real meaningful relationships. But students crave relationships. They crave authenticity. And so the small group is a place to give them meaningful relationships with other students. It's hard if you're new, you come into a youth group and there's 40 kids or 250 kids or whatever. It might be hard to find your place. In a small group, you're going to get to know students much more quickly. You're going to get to know who they are. You're going to get to understand their likes and dislikes. And you're much more likely, I believe, to make meaningful relationships. It's amazing to me, a lot of the young people that I have led their small group or I've mentored, their best friends have come from within our small groups. Either our small group started because it was sort of friends inviting friends, and that's how we built the small group, or we just we got a group of guys together and they developed into close friendships, close relationships in their small group. And so students can form meaningful relationships. Benefit number three, students can form meaningful relationships with mentors. This is, I think, really key because students not only need to have other students to be connected to, but they, as we said last session, they need their parents, but they also need just other adults who are able to encourage them in their pursuit of God, who are able to help them grow in their pursuit of God. They need meaningful relationships with mentors, with spiritual guides in their lives. Because, there's some stuff that just a student needs to talk about with an adult, but they don't want to talk about it with their parents. Just a couple weeks ago, one of our youth leaders, one of our youth volunteers, he came up to me and he told me about a guy in his small group. He's been leading a high school boys group for the last couple of years, and he was really concerned about one of the guys in the group because one of his students in his group had been dating this girl who was from a different religion, and she was beginning to influence him in a lot of negative ways, and he was becoming more interested in her religion, and he was beginning to go to her church more, and it was not a Christian religion, and so it was creating a lot of problems for him. But this kid, he didn't want to talk about it with his parents because kids just don't want to talk about their romantic lives with their parents, right? And so my friend, our volunteer, he was able to speak into this kid's life and to share some truth with him. And they have a relationship that's been built over 2 years. And he was able to say, look, I know that you like your girlfriend, but what's the purpose of dating? Why are you dating this girl? And if she has a completely different value system, a completely different worldview than you, where's this going to go? And how is this going to affect you and your relationship with God, which that should be your focus as a student right now. And so the student was left to ponder all these things, to wrestle all these things through the conversation with his mentor. And he came back to his mentor a week later and said, I broke up with my girlfriend, and I just think that this is the right thing to do. I think it's what God was leading me to do. And that happened because of their mentoring relationship. And so I hope you understand, again, this isn't just, we're talking about mentoring small groups. We're not just trying to fill kids' head with more theology. As great as theology is, we want to see them have transformed lives. And that can happen in the small group. Benefit number 4, and this is really meaningful to me, is your adult leaders are empowered to minister. Your adult leaders are empowered to minister. As I said, one of the drawbacks of a large service is that your adult leaders are kind of like, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm just supposed to greet, I'm just supposed to man the snack bar, I'm just supposed to, run the welcome table, or maybe you let them do announcements, like that's fun, all right, they got to do announcements. If your leaders are like our leaders, we had to say, okay, no more 15-minute announcements. This isn't your time to try out your little sermon, So sometimes it's hard. It's hard to know how to lead in a big youth group, or even in a youth group where the youth pastor does everything, where he's teaching every week and he's doing all that, and every student must be connected to him. What do youth leaders do? Well, small groups are deeply dependent on youth leaders. We always need more youth leaders now. I can't ever imagine a day where we'll be like, we're done with youth leaders, because as our youth group is successful, we have this terrible problem where it gets bigger and more students come, and that's a great problem. And so we need to break up our small groups and start more small groups. And so our leaders can really lead. Our adult leaders, because I have pretty much every adult leader, or every person I've ever met that says, I want to be a youth leader. And I say, well, why do you want to be a youth leader? They want to make a difference in a kid's life. Maybe they had a youth group leader when they were young that changed them, that transformed them, or they didn't have that, and they'd love to help students not make the same mistakes that they made. And so they want to pour into the lives of students. That's what they want to do. And a small group allows them to do that. You put adult leaders into small groups and allow them to lead students, and they can experience a real empowerment of leadership. They're really discipling students. And here's another thing. This is, I didn't plan on this as we've developed this model more and more, but we found that in our adult youth leaders, some of them are very young adults, some of them are college students. From our adult youth leaders, we've developed the next generation of leaders at our church. The next generation of small group leaders in general, or the next generation, we have people on staff at our church that started in youth ministry as volunteers, and now they're a pastor at our church, or they're a staff member at our church. And they learned a lot of the skills of discipleship and ministry just being youth leaders. And so youth ministry is a great place to catalyze your leaders. One of my pastoral mentors, he said to me, because I was leading junior high ministry at this church, and he said to me, if you can lead a junior high small group, you can lead a church. And I thought he was just trying to get me not to quit junior high ministry at that point. But it's true. If you can really master the skills of leading youth ministry, so many of those skills will apply to other parts of the church. So those are just some of the benefits of small group-based ministry. One other benefit that I would just also encourage you, I didn't list that on there, but one other benefit is it's just practically a lot cheaper. It's a lot cheaper to run small groups out of homes or out of a shared space or in a Starbucks or something. It's just a lot easier. And so if your ministry, like our church, we're always pressed for funds, it's simpler to run small groups. And it's simpler in some ways organizationally. It doesn't require staffing, and it really empowers volunteers, which is one of the main things that excites me. I just love to see regular church people doing the work of the ministry, because that's how it's supposed to be according to Ephesians 4. So those are just some of the pros. It's all those things that I've listed, as well as it takes less professional pastors to do youth ministry this way. It's cheaper, and there's a lot of we're not going to talk a lot about curriculum. Again, we have our curriculum available at pursuegod.org/youth. There's a lot of other good curriculum out there that's even free in this day and age, which is kind of nice. But I would encourage you to really consider the small group model. Now, there's a couple objections that you might anticipate, or a couple negatives about small group ministry. There's probably more than two, but there's just two that I want to address real quickly. The first is this: if your groups are bad, then your small group really suffers. Like, at a certain point, I almost have to flip this on its head and say sometimes it feels easier to pull off a youth service, because if you have a dynamic youth pastor, it's a lot easier to say to him, like, go be dynamic, go be charismatic, go deliver a great sermon. Sometimes it's a lot harder to get 24 adults together and say, we need to have 12 great small groups. That's a lot more work. And that's why you must invest in your youth leaders and in your mentors. You must train them before you allow them to lead others, and we're going to talk about that more in the next session. But if your groups are bad, then your youth group is going to suffer. But here's the great thing about that. The great thing is if you have a small group based youth ministry, then you only have one thing you really got to focus on. That's the small group. And you can spend all your time training and focusing and working to make those small groups great, and you don't have to spend a lot of time, a lot of energy on a lot of other stuff, because that's not the main point, right? That's not the main goal. The second issue, the second negative that you might think of, you might experience, is that small groups are intimidating for visitors. Small groups are intimidating for visitors. I don't know if you've ever experienced that at your church, but for students who are not Christians, it can be intimidating for them to walk into a small group. So what we currently do at our church, I'll just give you a little sample of what we currently do at our church, is, as I said, we have five campuses that have active youth ministries right now. The sixth one combines with another campus, so that's why we have 5. And what they do is, most of those, it's all small group centered. Most of those groups meet on Wednesday nights, and so what they have is each of them have at the campus a common time where they gather together and go over announcements and talk through different things, and they might play a game or something, kind of everybody in the same room, and then everybody breaks off into small groups. Now, I'll say that more and more we're less emphasizing that, and more we're finding youth small groups that are popping up on different nights of the week. But one of the reasons why we still do that is it's kind of nicer for visitors, for them to come to one of our buildings maybe, and there's more students there, and before they go into the small group they can see they're part of something larger. But I really think that the key for inviting new people into small groups is, so let's say that your youth ministry is just small groups. Or maybe you have a very young church, you're a church plant, you're a new church, you're a new ministry, and so you've got 8 kids, and you want to grow, and so all you have is a small group. Let me just say, if that's you, that is the best place to be. I envy you. I would love to. It's the best to be new and to be small and be able to start from scratch, because you don't have a lot of bad habits that you have to unlearn, like we've had to unlearn, and so there's a lot of opportunity there. And so what I would say is, if that's you, then you just need to train your leaders and even the students in your small groups to be ready to accept visitors. You know, we're always telling our students, we want you to invite your friends to the small group. And that means that if you have a visitor to your small group, that's probably not the night to talk about Calvinism and Arminianism, right? Like, it's probably not the night to talk about the age of the earth or something like that, something that's real controversial, that is going to be very confusing to a lot of the students there. So if you have your students and your leaders need to learn how to be ready to talk to new students, to talk to visitors, and so we've even just had a lot of training about how to handle new students. And this is the same thing. Hopefully at your churches you think through, well, how do we receive new people? If somebody who doesn't know God at all, somebody who's completely in church, they walk into our church, you know, what are they going to experience? You need to think through that for your youth ministry as well, and try and make it as unweird as possible. Now, really the best solution to this is if your students are inviting other students, then they're the ones who are going to make it more friendly for their friends, right? They're the ones who are going to explain what's going on. But always try and make sure that your leaders, your students know that they're here not just for themselves, but they're here for the new people. They're here for the new visitors. And that your small groups should be geared to also allow new students to come in. I was just, as I've been thinking about that today, I was just reminded of one youth group that that's actually the youth group I used to lead them a long time ago, and now they've had different leaderships. And their high school group went through this really in-depth theological book from like the early 1900s. And like, now I love theology. I love theology. I love deep theology. I love to talk about all those things that I said you shouldn't talk about with visitors maybe. And I mean, I love all that stuff. But it was just so surprising to me. I was talking to their leadership. I was like, how did your youth group go through this like book written in the early 1900s about theology? Like, how's that even possible? Like, are your students robots? And I was like, well, what do you do with new people come? And they were kind of like, oh, well, we haven't had any new student in a year. So I realized, you know, like, one of the things that we need to do if we're going to build small groups, it's not just so we can go deeper theologically. It's not just so we can learn more information. But it's so we can create meaningful relationships, and we need to create small groups in such a way that it'll help students grow, help students move forward. And so that's what we want to do. There's a lot of difficulty that comes with small group youth ministry. There's a lot of difficulty that comes just with small group ministry. If you've been involved with small groups, again, like I said, not just involved with the small groups in youth, but the small groups with our adults. And there's a lot of challenges in those. But I think all those challenges are worth it. All those negatives about small group youth ministry can be overcome. And the result is what we're about to get to as we look at our verse. In fact, let's do that now. Let's look at the next section in your notes, which is small groups enable generations of disciple making. I want to look at 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. And this is one of those verses, like along with the Great Commission, 2 Timothy 2, should just be something that you drill into. I hope everybody in your church, really, anybody who's making disciples in your church, especially your youth leaders, I hope this verse is drilled into them. It says, the Apostle Paul is speaking, and he says, "In the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." Now, I just love this verse because I like to picture, the Apostle Paul, he writes these words, and he writes them to his spiritual son, Timothy. So, Paul was a mentor for Timothy. He was like a spiritual father for Timothy. And he says, "Timothy, you remember everything that I taught you." And what do you think Timothy was taught by Paul? What do you think Paul taught him? I think he taught him everything that Jesus commanded, right? The Great Commission. That's what Paul was doing in Timothy's life, And then like how to be a church leader and all these different things, how to be a missionary. And so he preaches. So he says, "Timothy, all those things that I've entrusted to you, the things that you've heard me say, I want you to pass those things on to other people." So in other words, he's saying, "Timothy, I want you to go and make disciples. I want you to go and just like I've made you a disciple, I want you to go and make disciples." But notice, it doesn't end there. He says, "Timothy, I want you to go and make disciples of people who will then go and make disciples." See there, I snuck it in again, didn't I? The goal of youth ministry. We got it. There it is again. That's really the goal. I hope it's not just the goal of youth ministry. I hope it's the goal of discipleship. That you, or one of the goals of discipleship, one of the main focuses of discipleship, that you disciple people, you disciple students, who will then disciple other students, who will then disciple other students. See, what he's talking about here is generational. This is what I think small groups can unleash for us. They can unleash for us generational discipleship. That the goal isn't just to make a disciple. I used to think that was kind of the goal. I thought, man, if I could just make a disciple, when I was much younger, I thought, if I could just make a disciple, that'd be great. I'd love to just lead somebody to faith, help them follow Jesus, and I'd be like, man, there's my disciple. Like, there he is, right there, And I've learned that that's kind of the wrong attitude for a few reasons. Jesus is the one who really does that work in someone's life. It's not like me. But the goal is to help someone become a disciple who makes other disciples. That's when I've really accomplished my goal. It's not just making that one disciple, but it's making that disciple into a disciple maker. And that's what I would try and repeat over and over again in my life, is generational discipleship. And that's what we want to see with our students, that we're not done with them when they know a lot about the Bible and when they read books from the 1900s or whatever, that's not the end goal. The end goal is that they then go and make disciples of other students who then those disciples themselves are like, oh, I know I got to go be a disciple maker because this guy did this in my life, this gal did this in my life, and now they go and do that in someone else's life. And that's the dream, that's the vision. That's why I see 2 Timothy 2:2. That is the vision. That is the inspiring goal. I get up in the morning and I go to my small group, and I'm driving over to the house where we're going to have small group, and I am inspired by 2 Timothy 2:2. I just finished a cycle of small group with a bunch of young men at our church, ages 18 to 21, and so they're technically not in youth group, but again, they act like they're in youth group still, a lot of them, but I'm helping them grow up, I'm helping them. Unfortunately, I'm trying to fill in some of the gaps that they didn't get from that their parents didn't fill in for them. And so I'm trying to disciple them into adulthood, as men. And we just finished our cycle together, and I trained them on how to do this, how to fulfill this vision of 2 Timothy 2:2, how to now go and take what I did in their lives with the help of the Holy Spirit and the power of Jesus Christ, how to do that in the lives of someone else that they know, who will then pass that on. And the hope is to make generations of disciples. And again, that brings so much joy to see that in your church, to see somebody in your church who has several generations of disciples that they've made, people who have come to faith in Christ and have been transformed and then have gone on to make other disciples. I mean, I can't think of anything that would excite me more, and that's really where we want to go with all this, that we see students really trust in Jesus and really pass that on to their friends, to their siblings who are younger, to the next generation that's going to come up under them. And the vision of 2 Timothy 2:2, generations of discipleship. And so I believe that that can happen. I believe that God will accomplish that among us. And I believe that the best model for that is the small group and mentoring relationships. And you can begin to pull that off at your church right now. You don't have to wait until the youth pastor falls from heaven that you've been waiting for. You don't have to wait till you have all the resources. You don't even have to wait till you have all the training, as we're going to talk about next. You can begin that right now. And so that's the end of this session. And the next session, we're going to talk about how to really empower that last piece of helping students not only honor Jesus and obey Jesus, but to make disciples in their own lives. So that's the end of this session. So you can go ahead and just go to the discussion and questions now.